Okay, our second talk will be with Dr. Ali Eslami. He's currently a staff research scientist at DeepMind. He was previously at Microsoft Research, and he obtained his PhD in 2013 from University of Edinburgh before this whole deep learning boom. He's quite a well-known figure in the field, and some of his major contributions include the Pascal dataset, the attend infer repeat paper, and more recently the neural scene representation and rendering paper in Science, and the data efficient image recognition with CPC paper. His talk will be about representation learning without labels.
I will make the slides available later, so don't feel like you have to take notes as I'm presenting. You can always just read it after the presentation. So let's just get started. Like I said, 2 parts. This is the first part, and it'll be about 20 minutes. And I want to start off with a slightly philosophical introduction to the field. Some of you may have heard me speak about this before, but I think it sets the scene quite nicely. And in particular, I want to start with a philosopher you may have heard of, Plato. Plato is often depicted in pictures with his hands pointing at the sky, in opposition to his disciple Aristotle, who's often depicted with his hands pointing at the ground. And the reason why Plato's depicted in this way is because Plato believed in the philosophy of ideas, or forms, he used to call them. And there's a particular analogy or allegory that he used to describe this philosophy, or to kind of illustrate this philosophy. And that allegory is called the Allegory of the Cave. So what Plato says is that our existence as humans is similar to that of a bound prisoner at the bottom of a cave. And what Plato says is that this prisoner is bound in such a way that they can only face a wall that is situated in front of them. And behind this prisoner is another wall, on top of which are certain objects, which he considered to be the real truths that make up existence, you know, the realities of the world, or those forms that he referred to. Now, behind these real objects, he imagines firelight, which casts light onto the objects and therefore casts a shadow onto the wall in front of the bound observer. So what Plato is trying to emphasize here is that the bound observer can only see these shadows, and yet their job, in a sense, is to try to grasp at these true objects, to understand these true objects, and to represent them, and to figure out how they behave and what they mean. And what he's trying to say, or trying to emphasize, is that as humans, we only ever observe impoverished projections of reality, like either through our senses with our eyes or our hands, or even our brains. We never get to grasp full reality, and instead we only ever see these impoverished projections. And the business of philosophy and the business of thinking, to some extent, is about forming representations for those truths, despite the fact that we can never see them directly. So in a little bit more detail, the causal relationship that's going on here is that there is some truth. That truth creates an image, which is a projection of that truth. That image is observed by some intelligent being, whether that's a human or, say, a computer program. And that observer, their job is to form a representation for that truth from that image. And of course, the more accurate this representation is, in some sense, the better job the observer is performing here. So to be super concrete, we can say that if the true object was a vase, that image produced by that true object might be a 2D pixel image with black and white colors. And the observer would think in their head that, yes, I'm looking at a vase. So that would be the concept in their head, or the representation that forms in their head. And they would perhaps use this to predict what would happen to the vase, or what its contents may be. Now, this might seem simple enough, but actually presents a really challenging problem, which I call the representation problem. And that problem is that this true object, in fact, has many possible attributes that you may want to put in your representation. And it's not obvious which one you might want to go for. So, of course, this vase has a class. Its type is vase. But it also has a shape. And this shape is a particular kind of shape. It has a color. The color is blue. In fact, the color doesn't appear in the image, because in this particular example, the image is black and white. It has a height. It has a weight. It has certain properties, like whether it's scratched or not, or if it's broken or not. It has dynamic properties, whether it's moving or not, and many other things. So the representation that this observer has to form is actually not necessarily clear. There are many choices that the observer has to make in terms of what they choose to store in their head. And those choices are informed by what the observer might want to do later on, what the downstream tasks are. For instance, if they're doing classification, or if they're doing detection, or time series prediction, or any other task. So in a little bit more detail, the questions are, what are the attributes that I choose to put in my representation? And then following from that, what format do I use to make that representation? For instance, with shape, do I represent shape in terms of a name? Or do I represent it in terms of a voxel grid? Or maybe I represent it in terms of a mesh or some other format. How do we deal with partial observability? So for instance, with color, the color doesn't appear in the image. So when the observer looks at the image, how are they going to represent uncertainty over color? Do they just assume that the vase is black, or do they say, well, it could be blue, it could be red, it could be any other color? Same thing with the shape. The shadow doesn't fully specify the shape of the object, but only a partial constraint in the shape. And then there's computational considerations as well. How quickly can we form this representation given an image? Does it require lots of computation, or is it something that can be produced quite quickly? And finally, perhaps most importantly, how do we measure success? This observer doesn't ever get to see the objects truly. And that's the whole point of the allegory of the cave. So all this observer ever sees are these black and white images. And the question is, how does the observer ever know that they have a good representation? And in some sense, that's really the miracle of the human brain, that despite the fact that we never get to observe reality in the sense that Plato describes, we somehow yet manage to form representations that allow us to function intelligently in this world. Now, there's a particular solution to this problem that I'm sure you have all heard of and are very familiar with, and that is the supervised solution. So the supervised solution in this framework can be described as follows. First, we decide which attributes we care about. So for instance, we might say that I care about the class of objects and nothing else. I don't care about shape or color or anything else. I just want to know what class of object I'm looking at. Then we decide the format for each attribute. So for instance, we're going to say that I'm going to represent class with a string, with a name. So this is an object whose class is vase. This is an object whose class is ball. This is an object whose class is dog, and so on. So these are decisions that a human is making in advance of any learning happening. Then we create a large labeled data set. So these are going to be image and label pairs, like the one you see on the right. And then you train a deep neural network to predict the labels given the images. So this is the standard solution that powers much of machine learning in practice these days. So obviously this, I mean, it works extremely well. This isn't obvious. As Yasser said, you know, as little as 7 or 8 years ago, it wasn't clear that this could ever work. But now we know how to get this to work on pretty much any problem. So if you can come up with a data set that's big enough and you can train a network that's deep enough, then pretty much you can just find a solution to your problem with the supervised approach. However, the supervised solution has several problems, or at least there's several questions that can be asked of it. And we can go through them one by one. So first of all, who provides ground truth for the labels? What credentials does this person have, and how do we trust that this person is making correct judgments for those labels? So this is a serious problem, which I'm not going to go into much detail here, but is a big problem in the field of machine learning. And that exemplifies itself in questions like, what if we don't know the ground truth? What if we're dealing with a problem where the ground truth is actually not known yet? So for instance, if you're looking at images of stars in the sky, and you don't know whether a particular star is a black hole or not, what do you do if you can't come up with that ground truth yourself? Is the representation learning problem completely impossible there, or can something still be done? Number 3 is which attributes are chosen for labeling? Like, when I choose to represent these images only via their classes, I'm actually losing quite a lot of information, for instance, about their shape or their color or their size. What if the task that I actually want to achieve requires those things? You know, the resulting neural network will be useless for that. So how do we choose attributes, and how do we choose to ignore certain attributes? And this again has implications in terms of fairness and bias. So for instance, if we're dealing with human faces, do we train neural networks that are sensitive to skin color and age or gender? Or do we explicitly try not to be sensitive to those things? So again, this is a really sensitive and complicated question that arises partly because we are going for the supervised learning approach. And then kind of to further this point 5, what biases do the labels propagate? So when a human assigns a label to a data point, that could be very problematic because we have our own biases that we bring to the labeling problem, and that could create problems later on. For instance, when those labels are deemed to be incorrect or biased in some way. Now, more fundamentally, questions 6 and 7, do we really think that children learn only from labels, or do they have some other mechanism that powers their learning? I would certainly argue that children are capable of learning quite a lot without anyone ever telling them labels for things. So what is that learning mechanism? And in fact, if you think about animals, do animals learn from labels at all? Like, animals don't have language, right? So they don't really have any form of label communication, and yet they are remarkably intelligent. They can hunt and they can survive. They raise families. They do all sorts of things. And the question is, how are those representations formed? So perhaps all of this can be summarized with this final question: can useful representations develop without labels? Is that possible? And we can study this as a scientific question. And in fact, this is basically what I've been studying for my whole career. Now, before I go further, I want to highlight a point about terminology. And that is that you will hear myself and other people use terms like supervised or unsupervised, and labeled or unlabeled. And the point I want to make is that actually it's often not that easy to be clear about what is meant by supervised or unsupervised. in reality, one could argue that any learning system has some form of supervision built into it. And in fact, it might be impossible to have a purely unsupervised system. So for instance, if you think about image captioning, where you have an image and you have a sentence that you want to be generated by that by a model to describe that image, the specification of the caption, it's unclear whether that's a label or not, because we know that there are multiple captions that could be associated with each image. In fact, there potentially is an infinite number of captions that is associatable. Or, for instance, if you think about machine translation, where you have pairs of sentences in different languages, is one a label for the other, or are they just associated with each other through a relationship that isn't like that of a label? Or in reinforcement learning, when a human specifies the reward function that the agent uses to train, that specification of the reward function is itself a kind of label, even though reinforcement learning is typically considered to be different from supervised learning. In generative models, as we'll see in the next section, often there's quite a lot of structure that's designed by a human being, and that structure in and of itself is some sort of labeling. But even the most quote-unquote unsupervised of techniques, say, for instance, language models, you still train that language model on a specific data set, and the choice of data set has a huge impact on the kinds of representations that you learn. So the choice of data set itself is, in fact, a very strong form of label. So all this to say that, yeah, in my opinion, it's very difficult to use supervised and unsupervised as distinct terms. And frankly, I don't think it really matters what the precise definition of these terms is. What matters more is to be clear about the scientific objective in this field of work, which is to reduce the reliance on labels that can only be assigned by human brains, and to learn more from raw measurements of the world. So that is to say, to the extent that is possible, we don't want to use any data that is the result of a human brain. And in fact, we want to use more and more data that we can measure directly, for instance, with cameras or microphones or weighing machines or any other sensor that is a raw measurement of the physical world. Still, the term unsupervised or unlabeled is actually quite convenient, so you'll hear myself and other people use this in language, but it's important to not get hung up over the precise definition. I want to further kind of emphasize this point with an example. So for instance, imagine you were trying to create representations or learn representations for the musical instruments that you see in this image on the right. One approach, as we've discussed, is to create a labeled data set where you give each one of these instruments a name. So you say one is a violin, one is a viola, one is a cello, one is a sitar and a santur, and so on. And then you create that data set and you train and you have your representation. Now, the issue with this approach is that the labels, the data that you use to train this thing are really the product of human minds, in that there isn't a fundamental difference between a sitar and a santur or between a violin and a cello. It's really like arbitrary distinctions that humans have come to make over time. An alternative approach is to record the instruments alongside with recordings of the sound that they make, and then to come up with some learning scheme that associates the image with the sound. And then that representation is going to be much more nuanced than the one that would result from the supervised approach. And the latter is really kind of what I argue is the way we need to be going forwards. Now, this idea isn't a new idea. Representation learning arguably started right with machine learning back in the 1940s. And between then and roughly 2006, most of what we were doing was based on feature engineering and kernel methods. which were mostly supervised. And at around 2006, people actually started working more on unsupervised techniques like restricted Boltzmann machines that were used to initialize deep nets. But a watershed moment was 2012, as you all know, when AlexNet won the ImageNet challenge. And at that point, the whole field really converged on the supervised approach, and led to the gains that we're all familiar with now. But since then, even the most prominent members of our field have started to acknowledge that supervised learning isn't going to take us all the way there. So people like Hinton, Lacan, Bengio, and others have been very explicit about the belief that unsupervised learning or representation learning without labels is really one of the frontier problems that we have to tackle in order to make progress. But it's important to be clear that not everyone agrees with this. So in particular, I'd like to highlight a paper written back in 1991 by Rodney Brooks, who is, of course, famous for his robotics contributions, where he says that, in his opinion, there is no clean division between perception and reasoning in the real world. And he says that the brittleness of current AI systems attests to this fact. So what he's saying is that there's no division between perception and reasoning. What he believes is that it's a mistake to focus on learning representations before you have a task that you want to achieve. So you might say, well, I first want to learn to have a robot that understands the world around it, and then I'm going to ask that robot to wash my dishes or to clean my house. And in his view, this is a mistake. What you should be doing from the first instance is training a robot to wash the dishes or clean the house. And he articulates this point really nicely in this paper of his, Intelligence Without Representation. And arguably, his approach is the one that has had most success in the real world, with robots like Roomba, for instance, that actually are working in the real world. Nonetheless, we've had some really impressive recent progress in the topic of representation learning without labels that gives me a lot of hope and gives a lot of reason to be working in this field. And I'm going to highlight just two papers, one in the domain of natural language processing and the other in computer vision, that kind of show the power of these ideas in modern settings. So for instance, in computer vision, we wrote a paper a couple of years ago where we measured the performance of a deep neural network on the ImageNet classification challenge as a function of the amount of label data that it was allowed to train on during training. The red curve is how the deep net performs without any unsupervised learning. So as you reduce the number of labeled images, your performance drops from about 90% to about 45%. But we showed that we can come up with new techniques that have the performance profile of the blue curve, where if you decrease the amount of labeled data, your performance decreases at a much more favorable rate. So unsupervised learning is give us this boost in performance, which is really significant. It's going from 45% to 75% accuracy. And the same story also holds in natural language processing with models like GPT and BERT, where people have shown that if you pre-train on large bodies of text without labels, you can use those representations to then do things like sentiment analysis or question answering with much higher performance than you would if you only trained on sentiment analysis and question answering. So this idea is really beginning to work in challenging benchmarks as well now. Okay, so I'm going to end the introduction here, and perhaps we can take a few questions at this point, if there are any, before we dive into the building blocks. So let me see. Okay. Q&A. Yeah, I can hear you. Okay.
Finish. I asked a question of my own.
Okay.
So what do you think is the role of like looking at nature, like humans and animals, in when designing AI systems? So some people think that in fields like aerospace, when we stop thinking about how birds fly, we were able to like create like jets that fly much better than birds. So what do you think the role of looking at humans or animals is in when designing AI systems?
Yeah. So for me personally, the fact that humans and animals that are intelligent exist is the biggest motivation possible, because it shows that the solution to this problem is possible, right? It's feasible. It is possible to have a living or otherwise system that can digest information from the outside world, form representations from it that are useful, and to actually work with that. So I imagine if I was, an aerospace engineer 150 years ago, the fact that I could look up in the sky and see that birds do fly would have been a huge source of inspiration, meaning that it is possible. We just have to figure out how to do it. But I do agree that we don't have to necessarily be limited by the mechanisms that biology has come up with in order to achieve that. So we perhaps don't need biological neurons to for instance, have intelligence. We might be able to for instance, do that in silicon. Now, on a more practical level, I think there's two ways that we can influence each other. So machine learning, I think, like if I was president of the world and if I had to allocate resources, I would definitely want some people to study biological systems and try to figure out how those systems can inform us in terms of the architectures that we build in AI. So I think that's definitely something that is great that is happening. At the same time, AI itself might actually be necessary to understand biological systems, because one of the properties that makes studying the brain so hard is that it is a very interconnected, large-scale, fuzzy system in a sense. And so tools that machine learning provides might actually be necessary. It's not like studying the heart or studying different organs in your body, because there's billions of things in there and they're all kind of the same. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Okay, let me just get a glass of water. I'll be right back. Okay, I found that there is only unsupervised learning in real, or it can be the true model. Am I right? I'm not sure I understand the question. Let me go on to the next one, and then maybe we can come back to this. Further explain how you achieve better performance with less labels. Yeah, so we're going to come to this question in the next section. So I'll describe that in a second. Building a general model for solving all these questions seems very ambitious. Do we think we are in the right direction now? Right. So yeah, this is an interesting question. So I don't think that people know what the solution is right now. So there's a lot of research going on, and a lot of people are coming up with different types of solutions. And there's also a lot of disagreement. So unlike supervised learning, where we feel we kind of have a recipe that we can just follow to get good solutions, in unsupervised learning, that doesn't exist. So some people think that we need to build in structure, some people think that we need more data, some people think that it's just not possible, some people work on theory, some people are more applied. I think we are in the right direction in the sense that we're definitely making progress, and I'll show you some results later. Yeah, like I said, I don't think anyone has the single solution yet. And that's what makes it such an interesting space in terms of research, the possibility of finding that single solution.
So maybe the next one.
Yeah.
So on supervised learning, don't we have any labels, or labels can be created by machines?
Yeah, labels created by machines is possible, and I'll give you some examples of this in the next section. In reality, a label created by a machine is often a label created by an algorithm designed by a human that is run by a machine. So in a sense that there is that connection to human minds again. But yeah, it doesn't matter. That's kind of still okay, in my opinion. I mean, everything's okay, obviously. Like I said, to the extent to which we can decouple the representation from human thinking, we have succeeded, in a sense. And then going back to like the question earlier from Maxwell, it is an ambitious goal to decouple the representation learning system from human brains, but we know it's possible. Like you can look at a cat or a dog, and you can see that the system is intelligent and has nothing to do with human brains, and therefore we know it's possible.
Okay, so maybe another one. What about instead of finding a representation that increases the performance of a downstream task, instead focus on finding a compact representation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so compact representations are something that people have studied and continue to study. So that's potentially one good heuristic. You can say, if I have a compact representation, I think it's going to be useful for all sorts of downstream tasks. And many of the models that we're going to look at do use this frame of mind. I don't think there's any problem with this. At some point, you have to empirically demonstrate that this is useful. So you have to say, yeah, okay, I found a compact representation according to some definition of compactness, but then you have to actually show that, okay, this helps me with, I don't know, like self-driving cars, or it helps me with insurance prediction, or any other problem that you're interested in.
Maybe a more fundamental question, what is a downstream task?
This is a really interesting question. You can think of a downstream task in the true sense to be a task that you don't know about when you're training your representation. So imagine we play a game. You're the AI researcher, and I'm like an adversary. And then you claim you have a representation learning scheme. I say, okay, I believe you. Train your representation, and then I'm going to give you a task, at which point you can't touch your representation, and you have to do well at that task. And the fact that you don't know about this task makes this a downstream task. Now, why do I think this is a fair setting of the problem? It's because it's precisely humanity's ability to play well at this game that makes us so effective as beings. You know, like the representations that Einstein formed when he was a child, they weren't aware of the fact that he would be doing quantum physics later on in his life, and yet somehow they were useful for that. So in that sense, like, quantum physics is a downstream task for the representation learning algorithm that Einstein was running when he was a kid. Okay, and let's do one more question, and then I'll go back to the slides.
Okay, so maybe the last question. Biological systems evolve through evolution, so is it just machine learning, or evolutionary methods can be used in unsupervised learning as well?
Yeah, so this is also a really good question. Yeah, I think in my mind, actually, machine learning and evolutionary methods, they're not necessarily distinct things. They're both effectively optimization algorithms of various kinds. Now, a really interesting aspect of this question is that in the context of the planets that we live on, there is no downstream task, in the sense that everything on this planet has evolved to fit to the kinds of tasks that are necessary to survive and to thrive on this planet. And in that sense, on an evolutionary timescale, we have access to the test data, basically, right? Like, from the perspective of the evolutionary algorithm, our brains have been tuned to work well on the spatial resolution of the planet, on the temporal resolution of the planet, and the kinds of problems that we need to solve, like to be social, to find food, to run away from danger, all of those things. So it actually potentially provides a depressing solution to the representation problem, which is that maybe the only way you can find representations that are as good as ours for the kinds of tasks that we care about is to have gone through a millions-year-long evolutionary process. So sure, cats and dogs are smart, but maybe the only way to arrive at that is to have gone through the whole chain of events that have led to cats and dogs being on this planet. So that's potentially, that's the lower bound, basically, on how much we can do.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go back. You can see my screen, I guess. Okay. So this section is going to be a little bit faster and more fast-paced. So the representation problem, as I said, we have the realm of images and the realm of representations. And you'll notice that I've actually removed reality from this picture now because, like I said, we don't have access to it. And when you have these two realms, there's really two processes that you can think about. There's only really these two. I can't think of anything else. So one is a process that takes you from the realm of images to the realm of representations. And some people call that understanding. So when I look at something, I understand what it's about. And then there's the reverse process that goes from representations to images. And some people call that imagination. I think of a concept, and then I can imagine what the corresponding image would look like. And in the field of representation learning without labels, there's a real zoo of approaches that people have come up with in order to learn these representations. And we're going to look at several of them over the next few minutes, but all of them are effectively some combination of understanding systems and imagination systems. So some combination of these building blocks arrives at these different models. And in this section of the talk, I'm just going to describe those building blocks in a little bit more detail, and also how they have been combined to come up with every model that you might have heard of so far. So the first kind of component that is super important is something that people interchangeably call representation networks, or encoder networks, or inference networks. So these types of networks they're obviously neural networks that take an input X. Imagine X is an image. It takes X, it passes it through this representation network to arrive at a representation vector R. So I'm going to show inputs X in this format when you have a rectangle to signify that they are often spatially arranged, and they can often be larger than the representation R, partly because we want R to be compact, like we heard earlier. Now, when you're designing this kind of component, you have several decisions that you can make. For instance, you can choose how big R is, like is R smaller or larger than X? Is it more compact or not? Is R flat or is it interpretable? So for instance, can I read off certain values in R and ascribe meaning to them, or is it just a bunch of numbers? R, is it continuously valued or is it discretely valued? So the numbers, can they move on the real spectrum, or are they discrete? What shape does R have? Does it have a fixed shape, or can the shape of R change in response to the contents of X? Other questions like disentangled or not, which we'll get to in a second. So there's a whole bunch of things you can decide in advance when you build a system that has this component. And in fact, the representation network itself, there's several choices you can make. Is it a multi-layer perceptron, or is it a convnet? Is it a transformer? Is it recurrent? How deep is it? How many neurons do I have? What nonlinearities do I have? And so on. Now, in fact, more generally, before deep learning was the only thing that people cared about, and certainly when I started my PhD, we used to think of this component as being an inference algorithm. So it wasn't necessarily a neural network that you would do forward propagation on, but it could be an algorithm that had several properties. So for instance, that algorithm could be differentiable in the case of neural networks, or maybe it wouldn't be differentiable, like you would use Monte Carlo sampling to arrive at R. Maybe it was interpretable, say it was a computer program that processed X to produce R, like maybe like CIF descriptors, or maybe it's not interpretable, like a neural network. Is it deterministic or is it stochastic? So deterministic systems produce the same R every time you give it the same X, but a stochastic system might produce different Rs for the same X. Now, the corresponding component is the generator or generation network or the decoder network. So these are all the same. Now, the decoder network takes a representation R and it passes it through a network to produce an image X prime. And this is obviously the symmetrical analog for the encoder network. And just with the encoder network, you can choose whether it's an MLP or maybe it's a deconvnet or a transformer or if it's recurrent. And just like the encoder, the more general formulation of it is not in terms of a neural network, but in terms of a program, which we sometimes call simulators or renderers, which again can be differentiable or interpretable, deterministic, and so on. Now, if you take these two components and you stick them together, you arrive at a particular architecture that has been super influential in this field. And that is the architecture of the autoencoder. So the autoencoder takes an input image X, passes it through a representation network to get to the representation R. That's passed through the generation network, again, to arrive at a reconstruction X prime. Now, before I go into more details, I just want to emphasize that obviously autoencoders can be depicted in lots of different ways. So you can draw them like I did earlier, or you can draw them vertically, or you can break them in half. Of course, these are all the same objects mathematically. Yet another way of drawing them is like how I'm doing here, where you have X and I've minimized the networks, they're green and red networks. Now, let's look at a particular architecture that was introduced in 2006, where, for instance, you train an autoencoder on images of human faces, and you have fully connected encoders and decoders that map from 1,000 pixels to 2,000 units to 1,500 to a code that's 30. That's a very compact code. And then the decoder unpacks that back into a reconstruction. So this reconstruction is, if you train it well enough, is going to be similar to the input image. This object, you might wonder, okay, what's the point of this? It actually has lots of different uses. So for instance, you can use it for density estimation. So given a new image, this architecture can tell you whether that image is likely to be a face or not. You can use it for dimensionality reduction, where you say this code, this 30-dimensional object, is much less information than the image, and I can use that to compress my data. You can use it for image generation. So for instance, you sample random codes, pass it through the decoder to get random images. So you throw away the encoder and you just work with a decoder for that. You can use it for denoising, where you say, I have a noisy image, and you use this architecture to arrive at a denoised image. But what we're going to focus on is the use for representation learning, where we say, given an image, I'm going to compute this code, and I'm going to claim that that code is a useful representation of that image because I know that it can reconstruct. I know that that code contains the important parts of that input image, all of the important parts. And therefore, it's going to be useful for whatever downstream tasks that I care about. So that's the claim that autoencoders make for representation learning. So one way to visualize what the representation is doing in an autoencoder is to take the generator and to manipulate R one axis at a time, for instance, and to visualize what the generator generates as you change R in that way. So here I have a two-dimensional representation. So I have the first dimension, or the second dimension, and the first dimension here. And then I can say, well, if I change from this corner of my latent space to that corner of my latent space, what do I generate? And you can see it goes from 0s to 1s to 7s to 5s. So this is almost literally walking around the latent space and observing what each point in that space represents. Now, one modification that people early on made to autoencoders was to make them disentangled. And the intuition here is that you want to have R not as a single vector, but as separate components. Say you have a four-dimensional R, and you say, well, I want R1 to be as independent as possible from the other Rs, or as disentangled as possible. And you can come up with definitions of what you mean by disentangled. And the hope with this, or the kind of intuition for this, is that if you train this on a data set of, say, shapes that have that move around the image, or they have different colors and they rotate, you would want one of these axes to encode one factor of variation in the data. So for instance, if I move R1 and keep everything else fixed, what you see is that the object moves up and down. If I move R3, for instance, you see that it moves left to right. Or if you move another R, you see that it changes its rotation or its color. So, so the point of disentanglement is to make each axis in your representation be meaningful in some sense. And there's arguments why this is a useful thing to do in general. Now, another way you can take this architecture of the autoencoder and make it more expressive is to make it sequential. So whereas before we had one feed-forward neural network that produced R, now we can say that we actually have a recurrent neural network that looks at the image X multiple times and produces R in sections. So in a sequence, it says I've got R1, R2, and R3, and together they form my representation. And correspondingly, you can have a generation network that looks at R1, produces an intermediate canvas, and then looks at R2, completes that canvas, looks at R3 to generate the final reconstruction. So obviously, in addition to this just being more expressive and having more depth, another use you might have for this kind of architecture is to say, well, after I've trained this, at test time, I can choose to observe the image only twice instead of 4 times. So this is how I train, and at test time, I just allow it to look at the image twice. Now, obviously, this means that you only form 2 parts of your representation out of 4. But the point that you might want to use this for is that this you can think of as a highly compressed or abstract representation of the image X. So for instance, if I take images that are, say, 25,000 bits large, and I train a sequential autoencoder in the way that I just described, but I only allow it to communicate the first part of the sequence, so only the first 76 bits to the decoder, then the decoder produces images like this. So this means that the encoder has only had the chance to express, the the high-level concepts in each image, like the broad colors or the spatial structure, but not the details. And as I increase the number of bits that are allowed, I start seeing more details. So here at 112 bits, I have slightly more detail. At 200 bits, I have much more detail. At 380, I have yet more detail. And at 2000 bits, you can effectively almost see the entirety of the structure. So the sequential autoencoder, in addition to forming a representation, also gives you a way to kind of modulate how much information is stored in that representation. Now, combining disentanglement and sequentiality, you can say, well, this is fantastic, but instead of R just being a single vector that is uninterpretable, I want to change that so that my R actually has interpretable structure. So you say at every time point, I want the first part of my R to represent the presence of a particular object. I want the second part to represent the location of a particular object. And I want my third to, the third to represent the location, and the second to represent the content, or like what kind of the class of that object. I want my encoder to repeat until it decides that there are no more objects present, and at which point the encoder stops. So this is allowing the encoder of the architecture of the autoencoder to be responsive to the number of objects in the image, or to be responsive to the amount of content in the image. So it's like a self-selecting compression algorithm. So this is from back in 2016, where we created this demo where I draw on this canvas and the autoencoder places these bounding boxes around the objects to signify this is where I think the object is. And you can see in the bottom here how the architecture of the encoder changes in response to the content of the image. Now, what's important to emphasize here is that this is trained entirely without supervision. So the autoencoder is never told what an object is, or that the number 8 is composed of 2 parts, or how to localize things. All of these are emergent properties of the combination of the data set and the particular architecture choice that we made. So it's very different to how you would train an object detector, for instance, which is with supervision. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about generative query networks, which emphasize a different aspect of the representation learning problem. So the generative query network is a particular architecture that has 2 components. It has the representation network, like before, in red, and it has the generation network, like before, in green. But the 2 components are slightly different from the autoencoder in that the representation network now takes images and their corresponding viewpoints as input. So for instance, this is an image of a scene from viewpoint 1. This is an image of that scene, the same scene, from viewpoint 2. And then we're going to process each one of these images with a convnet. Each one of those arrows is a convnet to arrive at a representation for viewpoint 1 and a representation for viewpoint 2. And then we're going to combine those representations to now arrive at a representation for the whole scene. So the analogy here is to the famous parable of the wise men who were trying to, the blind wise men who were trying to feel an elephant in a room, and one person would feel the leg, and the other one would feel the trunk, and then the third would feel the tail. So each one would form a representation, and then if you were to combine those representations, you would get at the true representation for the contents of the scene. Now, if we claim that we have a good representation R, then we should be able to do the task of the generator network. So given R, we then provide a third viewpoint, so different from these 2, and we ask the neural network to produce what should be seen from that third viewpoint. And this neural network is sequential in order to give it the expressive power that it needs to make that image. So the claim to emphasize is that if I represent my observations correctly into this vector R, then given a new viewpoint, I should be able to produce a valid image of that viewpoint. And therefore, R will contain the, how many objects are there, what colors do they have, how are they located in the scene, and so on. And it turns out that if you train this well enough, you get some pretty amazing results, at least for the time. So here we have a bunch of observations. Obviously, these are just 2D images. And this is the neural network predicting what you would see in that scene if you were to move the camera. So as I move the camera, I see that I have the correct number of objects. They have 3D shape. They cast shadows. They have the right colors. They're in the right positions. And again, I want to emphasize that this is trained completely without supervision, in the sense that I never tell it what an object is. I never tell it how to detect an object. I don't tell it what a class is, what shape is, what color is. They're just emergent properties of the architecture of the network that we've trained. Now, there are modern instantiations of this kind of idea, for instance, in a recent paper called NERF, where instead of representing the scene with a vector, they in fact represent it with a neural network. So given an input, they actually run an optimization algorithm on that input to arrive at a neural network representation. And then when you run forward on that network, you get an image. And it turns out that this is a really expressive way of doing this, and you can end up with images that look like this, where each image is the result of a prediction by a neural network. So the neural network claims that it knows what's going on in the scene, and it allows you to generate these interpolated images, which is quite amazing. Now, there's lots of different choices you can make, like I said. So for instance, going back to the autoencoder, you might say, instead of it being a vector, I want my representation to be a volume. I want it to be a voxel grid. And so given an image, you produce a 3D neural representation that reconstructs. And then the benefit of this is that it allows you to then reconstruct that image from different viewpoints. Or alternatively, you say, I don't want it to be a voxel grid, I want it to be a mesh. And now you have to come up with a way of turning meshes into images. And of course, that's what renderers are really good at. So you can say, I want to use OpenGL. And if you do that well, then you can say, given an image, I'm going to produce a mesh. And then I can render that mesh to imagine the object from different viewpoints. And a modern instantiation of this is this paper called PIFU, where given an image, you represent it in terms of a mesh, and this allows you to predict what that person would have looked like from different viewpoints. So these are all different techniques for representing reality in different ways. Everything that I've talked about so far has been likelihood-based, in that we have to specify how good a reconstruction is. So this is the truth, this is the reconstruction. We define some loss and we minimize that loss. And this loss is often defined in terms of a likelihood. But it turns out that specifying a likelihood is actually quite hard. Like, we have to work quite hard to tell the computer what makes a good reconstruction and what makes a bad reconstruction. Now, an innovation that was made fairly early on was the concept of a discriminator network that is widely used in generative adversarial networks. And the discriminator network basically takes an input either of type 0 or 1 and is trained to decide whether it belongs to type 0 or 1. So for instance, you give it either a reconstructed input or a real input, and the discriminator has to decide if it was reconstructed or if it was real. If you combine this with a generator, you end up with the Gan architecture, which solves some of the problems that arise with likelihood-based training. So for instance, the generator produces, given a random representation, an image, and then that image is fed to the discriminator, who tries to detect if it's a real image or if it's a generated image. And if you train the generator and the discriminator well enough, you end up with generators that produce lifelike images, like the ones you see in this screen. So for instance, these face images on the right, none of these people actually exist. They're all the results of running a very well-trained generator forwards. What you will notice, however, is that this architecture doesn't allow you to compute an R given an X. So there's no way of going from an image to a representation, which means that even though a GAN is a very useful object for creating images, it's not so useful for forming representations. But if you are slightly clever about this, you can actually combine a representation network, generation network, and a discriminator to arrive at kinds of architectures like BiGANs that can give you that. So in a BiGAN, the discriminator is modified so that it takes pairs of representation images and decides if they are real or fake. So it takes a representation and its corresponding image as input, and it has to decide whether the representation looks fake, or the image looks fake, or if they don't correspond to each other. And when trained well enough, for instance, in the Big BiGAN paper from last year, you end up with a system that actually works quite well. So for instance, I'm going to take this image, I'm going to represent it to get R, and then I'm going to reconstruct it with G to get this image. Now, if you remember from the earlier parts of this talk, we said that we want R to be sensitive to things that are semantic and insensitive to things that are not so important, not useful for downstream tasks. And we can see that in the Gan architecture that we've got here, it looks at this image, and the thing that it seems to be representing is to say, well, basically there's a person wearing red clothes in a snowy scene, and that's what we're seeing down here. And it doesn't care so much about where exactly the trees are or what kind of clothes the person is wearing. So we would hope that this more abstract representation would be compact and useful for downstream tasks. And then kind of just to show that it is possible to go crazy, I'm going to tell you about an architecture that we worked on 2 or 3 years ago, where we combined many of these ideas into a single framework. So this framework has sequential encoders and decoders. It has a non-differentiable decoder. In particular, it uses a paintbrush simulator like Photoshop, for instance. And then also, instead of training it with likelihoods, we're going to train it with a discriminator loss. And if you do this well enough, you end up with a system that can take an image and it can represent that image in terms of an interpretable program, which you can then pass to Photoshop to generate reconstructions. And of course, if you can pass it to Photoshop, you can pass it to, for instance, a simulated arm, or in fact, a real arm. So here's a real robot arm that is executing the interpretation produced by this particular autoencoder in order to create these reconstructions. So the point here is that it's a structure that we've built into the autoencoder that creates these representations that have specific properties. The autoencoder that was introduced by Hinton in 2006, of course, you couldn't do this because the representation produced by that autoencoder is completely uninterpretable. There's no physical meaning to it. And if you train this same spiral architecture on, say, pictures of human faces and produce a reconstruction, this is what you get. And of course, this image isn't as good as the images that GANs produce. But what's interesting about it is that because of the physical constraints that we've put on the system, the reconstruction has many human-like qualities, i.e. qualities that human artists produce, for instance, a child or some modern artist. So remember, this system has only ever been trained on real photos of human faces. It's never seen a picture or a painting of a human face. And yet it's chosen to represent faces in ways that are similar to how we do it, like 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and a bunch of lines around the face. And for me, this is exciting because it feels conceptual. It feels like it's abstract in some sense. Okay, so in this last section, in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about going beyond generative approaches altogether. So the motivation for everything that I've been talking about so far has been to form representations. And yet we spend most of our time not in the representation arrow, but in the generation arrow. And this feels somehow undesirable. Can we learn representations without being generative? And the answer turns out to be positive. So a good motivation for this is, for instance, this example, where you start off with a data set of color images, and you deliberately make them black and white. And then you say, okay, given a black and white image, I'm going to pass that through a representation network to arrive at a prediction of how I should color the pixels. So for instance, this tiger, I want to color this orange, and I want to color the background green. Now, the intuition here is that the only way this representation network will know to color this orange is if it recognizes that this is a tiger. Now, of course, it won't know the name tiger, but the concept will be in that representation network somewhere, and that's the only way it'll know that this needs to be orange. Perhaps a better example is rotation prediction. So you might say, given this image of this tiger, can you predict the correct orientation of this picture? And again, the only way we'll be able to do this is if it recognizes this is a tiger, and tigers normally are not this way around, so I need to rotate it by 180 degrees. And the hope is that in the process, this representation network will learn a representation that allows you to distinguish between, say, tigers and bats. Okay? Now, this field is called self-supervised learning, and it's huge at the moment in computer vision. There's so many different papers that use, co-occurrence, ego motion, context, all sorts of techniques to make these kinds of predictions. And relating to one of the questions that was asked earlier, in my view, this is an example of a system where the labels are produced by a machine. So for instance, the color labels are easily produced by the machine that is training the representation network, or the rotation label is being produced by the machine that applied the rotation in the first place. Now, there's a particular form of non-generative learning that I think is useful to focus on, and that's contrastive learning. So contrastive learning, it's remarkably simple and it's worth going into. So what we do is we take 2 random images from our data sets, and we don't use their labels. So we don't care if they're tigers or dogs or anything else. It's just 2 random images. And then we're going to augment the first image twice. So we're going to maybe crop it, rotate it, resize it, change its colors a little bit to arrive at these 2 images. But the point is that we know that the transformations that we apply won't change the content of the image drastically. Like, they're not going to change the dog into a cat. It's still a dog, but it's just a different image of that dog. And now we have 3 images. We pass the 3 images through our representation network to arrive at R1, R2, and R3. But we do know that R1 and R2 are related because they come from the same underlying reality. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a loss that attracts R1 and R2. It says I want R1 and R2 to be similar to each other in some sense. And you know that R1 and R3 are from different images, so you want them to be different from each other. So you put a repellent loss between R1 and R3. And likewise, you put a repellence loss between R2 and R3. Now, after you've trained this, all you have is a representation network. So how do you test whether it's a good representation network? So one standard way of doing this is by taking your representation network, freezing its weights, and then training another network on top of that, a small linear network, to, for instance, predict ImageNet classes. So here, the representation network claims that it knows what a dog is and what a tiger is, but of course it doesn't know the words, the names for dog and tiger. So the hope is that the linear network, with its limited capacity, can basically just translate those concepts from the contrastive setting into words that we would understand. And it turns out that you can do really well. So top 1 accuracy with this technique, Simplier, gets about 76%. And I'm just highlighting rotation prediction and ByGAN just for context. 76% on ImageNet means that all of this part is trained without labels, and this part is trained with labels, and it's a single linear layer, and I'm getting 76%. And 76% is actually better than what we got with AlexNet in 2012. So AlexNet, with its 8 layers and millions of parameters, is actually being outperformed by a learning system that is mostly unsupervised and slightly supervised. So of course, this is really exciting. But another way of testing this is to test data efficiency. So you take your representation network, you don't freeze it, you stick on a larger network on top, and then you only train it on a small portion of your ImageNet labels. So for instance, you say, if I have only 1% of my training labels, how well do I do? And this is the curve that I showed earlier. A supervised baseline without pre-training and only 1% labels gets about 50%. But if you pre-train with Simplier, then you get something like 75%. So the difference between 50 and 75 is, of course, really significant. You might also want to do transfer learning, where you train a representation on an unlabeled data set, and then you transfer it to a different data set of a different kind. So for instance, Pascal detection. And I won't go into the details, but you do remarkably well. So I'm going to end in just under 5 minutes. I want to finally mention the surprising return of likelihood-based methods. So up until a few months ago, it was basically a shift was happening from generative models towards these contrastive or self-supervised techniques because they didn't need generative training. But there was a paper that came out 1 or 2 months ago that was really surprising from OpenAI, where they basically trained a GPT model on pixels. So you take an image, you turn it into a vector of pixels, and then given a bunch of, say, the first 4 pixels, you train to predict the 5th one. And it turns out that obviously you can train this to produce good samples, which in my mind are super impressive. So given this top half of the image, each one of these is a sample produced by the model. Now, of course, intuitively, you can see that this model knows that it's looking at a sheep because it's producing images that obviously correspond to sheep, or it knows that it's looking at birds, given the completions that it makes. But yeah, it turns out that if you train a classifier on top of these representations, you can actually, again, get good performance. So it's not quite as good as Simplier, so it's not 76, it's about 72, but it shows that even with purely generative training on a massive data set, you can learn these representations that are potentially useful. So I'm going to end the talk here with a short summary. So I hope you've seen by now that the representation learning problem is underspecified. Given an input, there are many types of representations you can come up for that input. And there's 2 kinds of approaches, I would say, broadly speaking. One kind builds in structure to obtain the right representation. For instance, the structured autoencoders that I showed. The second kind trains for a proxy task that can only be solved with the right representation. So for instance, the contrastive learning task or the colorization task. And these are two philosophically different approaches to this problem. Either way, there appears to be a certain trade-off between the generality of the representation that you learn, i.e. what range of downstream tasks the representation is good for, and interpretability, so how much control we have on the content of the representation space and how much we understand what's going on in the little bits and pieces of the vectors. So most of the general representations we have are uninterpretable, and most of the interpretable representations we have only work on specific data sets. And in some sense, this is a serious problem. So because of this, in my view, representation learning without labels is still largely unsolved. We don't yet have a super powerful general representation learning algorithm that works across all data sets, across all modalities. And that's what makes it a research problem of interest. However, we're seeing lots of really good progress in recent years, again, giving us hope that we will make progress in this space. So I'm going to end it here, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, if there are any. Thank you. Okay.
Without the human opinion? If so, do you think it's a right direction to go to?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a good question. I think it does make sense to evaluate algorithms without human opinions, but it's not very easy, I would say, because you have to convince people that your evaluation is meaningful somehow. A good analogy that comes to mind is like imagine you have a human that grows up in a forest separate from all other humans for 40 years. So this person for 40 years lived by himself in a forest and has clearly survived. And they enter human society. And now we know, obviously, that this person does have representations of their mind, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to survive. They know what danger is, they know what food is, and all of that. But they wouldn't be able to communicate that to us because they don't speak our language. Now, I think it's okay for us to then train this human to say, okay, like this thing that you call like a cat, we use the word cat for. And then you can use that shared language to test the representations. And I think in some sense that's what we're doing with these computers when we do put in some human input at the end. Now, it's possible that you can come up with potentially like a mathematical criterion that says, like, if the information content or if the entropy of this representation is high or low, then that's a good representation or not. And that's certainly possible. But I think people will have to demonstrate empirically that that is correlated with performance on tasks that humans care about.
Okay, so there are a few questions about GANs. I will ask them.
Okay.
Do you think we can use GAN to produce artificial forms of protein sequences which can be used in drug industry? And there is another one asking, do you think we can use GAN to create a distinct accent in speech?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think both of them are possible. I think probably people are doing both right now, I would guess. So yeah, you can use GANs for all of these things. I think it's important to recognize the pros and cons of GANs with regards to other architectures like, say, likelihood-based methods. So GANs are really good in that they produce things that look real. So visually they look good, auditory they might sound good, the proteins might look very plausible, but they also have some difficulties. One is that it can be difficult to empirically or quantitatively measure the quality of the generated output because you can't compute likelihoods. The second is that GANs sometimes suffer from mode collapse problems, so quote unquote. And of course, this is something that people have worked on and are continuing to work on. But it's important to, if you're using GANs for these applications, to be clear why you're using GANs and say why you're not using an autoregressive model like a Pixel CNN or like GPT or a VAE model or some other likelihood-based model.
Okay. So there is an interesting question. Is there any biological evidence whether our brain has disentangled representation?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. Another one is, it says in biology, representation learning is somehow sequential instead of being done immediately. How can you justify it in generative models? My question is related to lifelong learning.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this different parts of this question. Representation learning is sequential on a bunch of different timescales. One is that a property that our brains have is that when we think of a problem for longer, we tend to kind of form better solutions or better representations for that problem, which means that our brains have this property with where, if you imagine plotting it on an axis, quality is correlated with computational time. So there's a line that goes up. Whereas for many of our neural architectures, that's not the case. So if you give me an ImageNet network and 1 second of processing time, I'll give you the same answer as if you give me 10 hours, because I'm just doing one forward pass. So there's no iterative thinking, and that appears to be problematic, I would say. But I think this question is asking on a different time scale, which is like, how do my representations change as I learn over the course of an entire lifetime? I think that's, I mean, obviously that is something that we have for ourselves. I think people haven't, to my knowledge, looked at this very much in the representation learning literature, not because it's not interesting, but because it's hard enough as it is when you have access to all the data, so where you can shuffle the data however you want. And that feels like an easier problem, and still we find it very hard. So by making the problem harder, by saying, okay, I have like first year of data, then a second year of data, then a third year of data, you might find it more difficult to arrive at the solution. But maybe also it gives you insights that allow you to tackle the problem in new ways. So that's yet to be seen. But yeah, I'm not very familiar with lifelong learning for representation learning. Of course, this is something that people have looked at quite a lot in reinforcement learning, which obviously also includes representation learning. But yeah, that's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay, so we have a lot of more questions. Maybe we go over them quicker.
Okay.
Another one says, is disentangled in disentangled autoencoder, is it possible that these axes are not interpretable to humans? So putting interpretability aside, what is the main advantage?
Yeah, there's to be honest, I'm not sure. There's a paper that came from Google Brain last year where they looked at disentanglement and its relationship to information maximization. And that paper and many others also are not clear why we want to go for disentanglement. I personally don't have a good reason for why disentanglement is what we want necessarily. Like, it's something that we can strive for, but I don't see why we necessarily need it.
Okay. And in attend, infer, repeat paper, you define a prior and latent representation denoting where, what, an object. You impose an inductive bias manually. Is it sound? I think for specific use cases, it might be sound, but I don't think our brain does this generally. Like, or at least it doesn't do it at every level of processing. So my view on this has changed a little bit.
A good example for this is like if you look at a single sheep, or if you look at two sheep on an image, then yeah, okay, you're going to say there's one sheep here, there's one sheep here. But if you look at like a flock of sheep, so you've got 1,000 sheep in front of you, I don't think my brain goes sheep, sheep, sheep 1,000 times. I think it just says there's one coherent blob of sheep and there's 1,000 of them there. So I think that kind of scenario is where the attendant for repeat architecture kind of falls short. Having said that, as a human, I definitely do have the ability to identify bounding boxes around objects. So if you, even when I have 1,000 sheep in front of me and someone says, point at 3 of them for me, I can do that, right? So at some point in our brains, we do have that ability, but whether that's imposed in the architecture or if it's a consequence of the representation, I now believe that it's a consequence. So it's like it's a task that I perform, not a property of the representation.
Okay. What was the general idea behind representation in the recurrent neural networks? Does the evolution results to a better representation as time goes by? And also, I also have a question related to this. So in this recurrent autoencoder, why and how the network tries to represent the main idea in the first decoding steps and the details in the later ones? Is there anything that forces the network to do so, or is the network guided to do so?
Yeah, so the recurrent VAE stuff, I kind of skimmed a little bit. There's many different variants. The first time people did RNNs for VAEs was because they wanted more expressive power. So they thought that a single forward neural network wouldn't be able to give you an R that's good enough. So with more depth, you would get better results. And this was separate from abstraction. A good example of this paper is DRAW, Deep Recurrent Attentive Writer. Then there was another paper called Towards Conceptual Compression, where we do have some constraints during training that force more conceptual information to be at the beginning of the RNN. And I forget the details of exactly how they did this, but it was something to do with the KL terms that were imposed. I forget the details. But once you have the RNN architecture, you can put in those priors or biases. Yeah.
Okay. In your talk, you didn't mention probabilistic models like normalizing flows, for example, and their use in the field of representational learning. Do you think working on these models is a promising approach?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, normalizing flows are useful in and of themselves for lots of different reasons. And you're right, they are an alternative to VAEs. An interesting property of normalizing flows is that I'm not an expert on flows, but if I remember correctly, is that they insist on this bijective mapping between representation and the image. An interesting property of this means that they only ever transform data. They never reduce data, in a sense. And so that can be both a good and bad property. The good aspect of this is that you never lose data, which is a good thing. The bad property is that you have to work harder to define what abstraction is or what representation is if all you're doing is basically rearranging your data. So it's like exchanging computation for spatial rearrangement, in a sense. Definitely worth looking at as a model type. There's lots of interesting research happening there right now.
Okay. So we are kind of over time, but we have like a few more questions. If you have time, we can go quickly over them, or if you don't have time, we can just end it here.
Yeah, I've got a few minutes, if that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one asks, do you have any ideas that which types of tasks are qualified for solving by unsupervised machine learning?
I think unsupervised machine learning can help for every task that you can conceive of. I think they're going to be most useful for tasks where labeled data is difficult to obtain. So difficult can be for several reasons. Either it can be expensive. For instance, it's difficult to get labeled data for how you should run an economy, right? Because every time you make a decision for the economy, it affects millions of people, and so you can't collect that data easily. That's type 1. Type 2 is where it's just not possible. So, for instance, if you're like I said, if you're dealing with astronomical objects that are really far, or if you're working with microscopic objects that are really small, we just don't know what the true labels are. Like with a protein, for instance, we don't know what shape it has. Or with a star, we don't know what type it has. So there, I think unsupervised learning can be really helpful because the labeled data is very, very difficult to obtain. And therefore, the more we can use unlabeled data, the more impact we can have. But it should, in theory, be useful everywhere.
Okay. In high-resolution medical images, always lesions are small in compare with the whole image. So downsampling to feed to deep network in learning phase will lose lesion. What is your idea? This is like an interesting problem. How do you feed data into the network?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, this is a tricky problem. It's very, it feels a bit application specific. I mean, in medical imaging, there's architectures that have worked particularly well in medical imaging. For instance, like the UNet architecture. It observes the same thing about this kind of multi-scale nature of medical imaging and kind of proposes an architecture for that. I don't feel like I have a general solution to this. I mean, there's going to be things like attention that are going to be important. There's going to be things like multi-scale that are going to be important. But yeah, I don't think I can comment on that in more detail.
Okay. So maybe one more. Could you please give examples of how training instances look like in 3D scene representation net or any other networks?
Training instances. I'm not sure what you mean. So in the 3D scene representation papers that I showed you,
yeah, the DQN paper maybe she's referring to, I think the training instances are images and the coordinate of the camera, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the instances are just two-dimensional arrays of pixels, and the coordinate is 3 numbers, like say the X, Y, Z of the camera, or 6 numbers, the X, Y, Z, and the orientation of the camera. In general, I think more recent papers infer the position of the camera. So you just need a bunch of images, and then like SLAM, they infer where the camera was when that image was taken. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe a last question. Do you think that the reconstruction loss that is typically connected to the likelihood based learning is holding back the representation learning problem? Like, for example, don't you think that's the reason that the attend infer and repeat paper will not scale to more realistic settings?
Yeah, I think for sure. So the reconstruction loss is really, really problematic, and that's partly why these contrastive methods have been so successful. So in attend, infer, repeat, for instance, when you go to realistic images, you have realistic images often have complex backgrounds. If you look at the kind of scene that I'm sitting in right now, there's my face, but there's all sorts of things going on in the background with the lights and the objects and so on. And you would be surprised what the reconstruction loss is sensitive to and what it's not sensitive to. So it might care much more about the pixels in the background than the face in the foreground. And if that's what the loss cares about, the model is going to care about it as well. and so it's not going to represent the objects that that are actually of interest. Yeah, so for sure, this is one of the main reasons why generative modeling finds it so hard to be applied. Having said that, papers like ImageGPT showed that maybe if you just make your models like 1,000 times deeper and larger, then it will learn everything, and then at that point, it will learn both about the face and the background perfectly, and therefore it will have the right representations. This is one of the questions that remains to be answered.
Okay, thank you very much. We really enjoyed your talk, and thank you for staying a bit longer. So with this, I think we conclude this session of the summer school, and yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for the questions. Yeah, feel free to get in touch by Twitter or email or anything else. And enjoy the rest of the summer school.
Okay, bye.
Bye.